everyone. Welcome to London CND Podcast. This is a new venture to us. You'll find us on Spotify, Instagram, YouTube, or even our website. And if you like what you hear, please give us a listen, give us a like, and give us a follow. Today's topic is European rearmament. In the past 5 years or so, there's been significant shifts in European defence policy, greater investment in the arms industry, speeding up the manufacture of armaments, research and development into new uses of technology in warfare, drones, AI systems, etc. And all of that's been accompanied by a greater integration of the arms industry across Europe. All of that's gone on quietly behind the scenes, as it were, without much, if any, exposure to public debate. The war in Ukraine and President Trump's second term of office have accelerated these developments. Trump is piling on the pressure for NATO member states in Europe to contribute a higher proportion towards NATO costs, and he's making it clear that Europe isn't priority for the United States. He's turning attention towards China and the Asia Pacific. European rearmament is now accompanied by increased efforts to create a common military framework across Europe. And this debate is beginning to break through into the public arena in Britain and elsewhere as the shift in respect of military policy takes the form of increased military spending. One of Keir Starmer's first acts when Labour took office last July was to set up the Strategic Defence Review, which you probably are aware recently reported. Earlier this year, however, before it did report, Starmer announced in advance that the UK military spending will rise to 2.7% of GDP from 2027 on, and the intention is to reach 3% after the next general election in 2009. The fact that military spending is rising at the expense of Britain's international aid budget and welfare cuts in particular has pushed the issue of rearmament up the agenda and started a national conversation about the impact on other areas of government spending. So far, this conversation about increased resources to the military is almost entirely one-sided. It's taken for granted that preparing for war is the best way of preserving peace. CND wants to change the debate. We want to change that assumption. We're asking the question, why does protecting the interests of the majority really mean war? And how should our governments go about protecting the security of people and planet? And this podcast is a contribution to that discussion. Let me introduce our guest. He's known to many of you. Tom Unterrainer is the chair of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. His day job is working for the Bertrand Russell Peace Foundation, and he's editor of The Spokesman. Tom was active in Nottingham and East Midlands, CND, until recently when he moved to West Cornwall. He tells me that he's now got a new project. His family have adders in their garden, snakes in their garden, and Tom and his children are busy making a protective shelter for them, one of the many ways in which they engage in nature pursuits in the bit of spare time that Tom has between his campaigning activities. Okay, so welcome, Tom. Thanks very
Carol.
much. Thank you for taking part. Hope you were happy with that introduction.
I was, thank you.
Good. And let's turn to the first question. Spending more money on the British military means more money on Britain's nuclear weapons system, doesn't it, Tom? There was a recent announcement in Parliament that Britain will be securing nuclear-capable F-35A fighter jets from the United States, which can deliver satellite-guided nuclear bombs for use on the battlefield. In other words, the government is expanding the range of its nuclear weapons system. It's not simply capable in future of delivering nuclear weapons to their target underwater by the submarines. It is also planning to have the ability to deliver nuclear weapons by air as well as by sea. What should CND be telling the British public about that, Tom?
I think many of you listening to this will already be horrified by that headline announcement that Britain intends to expand its nuclear blueprint as it was and diversify and proliferate, in fact, its capabilities from submarine launch missiles to air-dropped gravity bombs. I think there are a number of things we need to get our head around in terms of just why the government is doing this. The headline, for me, the headline reason is, I think they've been honest about. So when you have a government which already has a nuclear capability such as the Trident missiles, which then announces the possible introduction of a whole new class of nuclear weapons of a slightly different character, then we should be on the alert. Because these aren't simply, just another mirror image of the Trident missiles. These bombs, these F-35 jets, they are intended as battlefield weapons. Now, just get your head around that. That's the purpose they were designed for. Some nuclear weapons experts, especially establishment ones, would label these types of nuclear weapons as usable nuclear weapons. Sometimes they're called tactical nuclear weapons. Now, I balk at this. A nuclear weapon is a nuclear weapon is a nuclear weapon. They're all weapons of mass death and destruction. But these particular ones were designed for a purpose. And that purpose is to be used on the battlefield. So that's the first thing. Why are we buying them then? Well, because we have a government that can conceive in its overall strategy. It calls it a defence strategy. It's obviously not a defence strategy, but it conceives of the possibility where Britain might use these nuclear weapons. Now, that puts a question mark, does it not, over everything we're told, all of the myths, all of the rubbish that our government and nuclear experts in the military come out with about what the purpose of these weapons is. They tell us they're a deterrence. And yet, the deterrence that Britain allegedly has now, the Trident nuclear missile system, the continuous at-sea deployment of these weapons of mass death and destruction, we're now to believe, or we're now to understand, that they are not sufficient to keep us safe, in inverted commas, or to ensure security. So far from being the cornerstone, this weapon system, far from being the cornerstone of Britain's defence and security, there are now question marks over it. And just one more point on this. People will have probably seen Starmer's speech to launch the Strategic Defence Review. And he opens his speech by, in his own words, celebrating the record-breaking voyage, 200 plus days of a nuclear-armed submarine. And he was so excited by this that he went out to meet the boat with John Healey, the Defence Secretary, on its return from this record-breaking, as Starmer put it, voyage. Now, we're supposed to believe this record-breaking voyage was a good thing. It's something to be celebrated. It's something that proves the mettle and the resilience of Britain's nuclear capabilities. But the fact of the matter is, it was only out at sea for all of that time because of the 4 nuclear-armed submarines that are supposed to be available for this ongoing mission, Operation Relentless, the mission is called. It seems to be the case that none of the other submarines were seaworthy, were capable of being deployed on this mission, which puts a big question mark over actually what is going on. So far from being something to celebrate this record-breaking mission, it was actually an indication that what they call the ultimate guarantor of security, what they call the cornerstone of Britain's security, is in real trouble, and huge amounts of research are out there indicating that this is indeed the case, that despite the billions upon billions upon billions that are spent on maintaining this continuous at-sea deterrent, as they call it, there are real issues and real problems. And so we have proliferation, and so we have a ratcheting up of the danger, we have a ratcheting up of the risks.
That is a pretty scary response to that question, really scary.
I think we should take them seriously,
Absolutely. I just want to ask you a bit of a follow-up, if I might. We're in the run-up to the 80th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the 2 Japanese cities, in 1945. And I think most people are aware of the incredible death and devastation that followed that. When we talk about battlefield nukes, and there are all sorts of other descriptions of them, I've heard them called mini nukes, as if they were sort of nice little toys for your children to play with. The whole of the euphemistic language suggests that they're not really instruments of mass death. Can you give us, for instance, a comparison between the damage that was done in Hiroshima to the sort of damage the mini nukes, the battlefield bombs, would be capable of doing if we use them somewhere on the territory of Europe?
It's my understanding that these, I'll use the technical label for them, these B-6112 new gravity bombs, US manufactured, US designed, just like all of the other nuclear capabilities that Britain has access to, wholly dependent upon the United States. But that's another podcast, and perhaps that's what to consider. These B-6112s have something called a dialable capability. And what that means is that, I suppose, like the power setting on your microwave, I'm trying to find a relatable example, and I don't mean to trivialize the gravity of any of this, but like the power setting on your microwave, the technicians, before these bombs are loaded onto the F-35As, technicians can set the yield, so set the destructive capabilities of these weapons. And I can't off the top of my head remember the exact equivalent to the bombs that were used at Hiroshima and then at Nagasaki. 2 different bombs, 2 different yields in and of themselves, nevertheless incredibly destructive, resulting in the instantaneous deaths of tens of thousands and huge amounts of damage and long-term lingering health effects. Well, the capabilities of these dialable, adjustable battlefield nuclear weapons ranges from the sort of scale we saw at Hiroshima and Nagasaki to 2 or 3 times the amount. They are in and of themselves weapons of mass destruction, causing instantaneous death and huge amounts of damage. So you can get very involved in the technical details, how much damage, how many lives, so on and so forth, from one of these bombs. But we won't just be talking about one bomb being used. Even if that was the case, even if there was just one nuclear detonation by accident, say, on a battlefield or in a battlefield situation. In fact, all of the modelling, all of the simulations, they call it war gaming, and these war games and simulations happen on a regular basis. And all of the indications are that one use of a nuclear weapon, no matter its size, is more than likely going to trigger a larger scale nuclear confrontation, if not all-out nuclear war. So they call them tactical or battlefield weapons, dialable, low yield, whatever. The small ones that we might, actually threaten to use in battlefield Europe, which is what they're busily crafting. The use of just one of those could result in all-out war, the sort of war that civilization, humanity would not recover from.
Thanks, Tom. I happen to know that you're a scientist by background.
Mathematician.
You're a very useful person to ask about the technicalities. But you and I both know that the issues we're talking about are not simply technical issues. They're political, and for us, for CND, they're campaigning issues. So let's move on to some of that stuff. It's not just Britain that's spending more on the military, of course. President Macron has said he's aiming to raise French military spending to 3.5%. He's recently proposed a very scary discussion about locating French nuclear weapons across Europe. The new German Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, he's backed Trump's demand for Europe to spend 5% on the military, and Merz has said he's willing to raise Germany's military procurement budget to 3.5%. On top of that, the Council of Europe has loosened its borrowing rules to allow European members to borrow more in order to spend on military. So that's the issue that's bringing what we're discussing to the forefront of debate in Britain and across Europe. But Europe, as we both know, is more than the European Union bloc. Do you think there's enough of a consensus across the continent as a whole, Tom, to achieve some sort of integrated military strategy for Europe in the foreseeable future?
I'll come back to answering that question as best I can after I've kind of set out some of the background and actually just how severe and just how extreme and unusual some of the decisions being made by not just the European Union institutions, but individual European states are. And, you can get lost in marginal percentage increases, but the bottom line in terms of what governments are proposing to spend or increase their spending on their militaries, amounts to tens upon tens upon tens of billions of euros. Huge amounts of money. There's talk of a lending facility and a loan facility, which I'll come on to in a moment. But the question is, who's paying for these massive increases and who benefits? Across Europe, the picture is pretty similar. That it's uneven, but it's combined. There are large pools of extreme poverty, deprivation across the continent. There are questions around infrastructure. There are questions about healthcare. All of the things we see in the United Kingdom are replicated in these European states. People are suffering. Just look at the examples of Greece, which has always had and always maintained, despite various changes in government, huge amounts of military spending. Even whilst the health service, the whole economy was on its knees, their level of spending and contribution to NATO maintained very high indeed. So, you see a similar thing going on in Italy, where the government there is proposing to massively increase its military spending, whilst all sorts of social questions and social issues in that country remain unaddressed. And so these proposals will have a huge impact domestically in the individual European states. And in a number of places, I just heard this morning, for instance, that there will be a very large demonstration in Greece in opposition to military spending later this month. They will join huge demonstrations that have already taken place and will take place again in Italy around military spending. So the picture I want to paint is, although you have these announcements of increased spending from the top, from the governments, and their intention is clear, they are going to increasingly face problems on the street and in the unions. I mean, I just heard as well this morning that one of the large Italian trade union confederations has finally signed up to the Stop Rearm declaration. Well, perhaps we'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. So they can try at the state level, at the leadership level, to forge some kind of united approach and some firm block in the direction of European remilitarization. But we're seeing the rebirth of the peace movements and the protest movements across Europe in reaction to this. And this is all the more starker in the European Union states, for instance, than it might otherwise be, because for decades now, 30, 40 years or more, there's been an ongoing argument within the European institutions about lending and about borrowing and about generating the funds needed for the European-wide project, the EU-wide project. Now, originally, the proposals for this increased lending facility were in order to do things like remove the prospect of widespread unemployment across Europe, to rebuild infrastructure, to ensure everybody had a decent job, to ensure everybody had housing, to ensure social provision, infrastructure, so on and so forth. And again, quite detailed plans were put forward and proposed for such a facility at the European level that the European institutions could create to float these urgent social measures. It was rejected. It was blocked. No. But the exact same mechanism for raising this money, for releasing these funds, has been put in place for increased military spending. And people see see what's going on here. It's quite clear, and it's an extraordinary amount of money. And I'm afraid that one of the things that the British government is doing is, part of its renewed relationship with the European Union institutions, part of the spur for that is not things like, access to the Erasmus scheme, easier movement across Europe, increased environmental standards, so on and so forth, stuff like that. It's so that they can access or seek to access this facility. And so the problems are starkly put in that sense. So I've alluded to the scale of actually what is going on the European level, and it's the extreme lengths that they're going to provide this money for rearmament. We already know that there is opposition brewing on the streets of a number of the Western European Union states. But Europe as a whole, as we know, is not united on this question. Neither are NATO member states in Europe, EU members or not, completely united on the question of rearmament and exactly where these arms are to be pointed. And it's not, across Europe, we see a process, a political process, where question marks are put on or put over ongoing participation in the foreign policy direction of the European Union. And, it's simply the case that parties and individual leaders who dissent from this direction of travel are being elected as leaders of European states.
Now, this is a really interesting answer from you, Tom. I must say it wasn't one I was expecting. You and I have had conversations in the past about the degree to which it's likely that sort of across Europe, you'll get agreement on defence and foreign policy issues and so on. And it's always been my impression that you were more inclined than me to think that that Europe as a whole would come to an agreement. I think part of that sort of discussion is driven by the fact that the context for rearmament is put increasingly openly, in fact, is put within the possibility of having to wage war with Russia. Now, I know that you and I don't see it in that sort of way. Personally, I would say the enemy, the danger, is NATO, not Russia, which is not to deny that there are security concerns in relation to Russia, but is to put into context the reason, in my opinion, that rearmament is taking place is to support the NATO alliance activities across the world. That's beyond the scope of this podcast, I know, but that's my view, and I imagine you share at least some of that. So let me ask you as the third question, if I may. Some of these issues are going to be tackled at the NATO summit, which is coming up in a few weeks' time. Do you think that what we're talking about will be raised at the summit? How will it be raised? And perhaps you could just mention what CND's plans are for making a protest around the summit.
Thanks, Carol. I mean, people will have seen that Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, was in the United Kingdom over the past few days. And this man's an extremist. Really, I mean, the concluding remarks, I mean, I don't use that word extremist lightly, but it's almost, tabloid headline levels of extreme recklessness that he deployed in his closing comments to UK audience. You better rearm or learn Russian. I mean, this is breathtaking recklessness. But to his credit, Rutte is at least more honest than Keir Starmer, because in the whole of the SDR and in the public comments, the debates in Parliament, the speeches, he didn't say, what was plain for everybody to see. He took some notice of the details of what was in the SDR. And this is about their intention to militarize themselves at the prospect of war with Russia. And that won't have gone unnoticed. That won't have gone unnoticed in the Kremlin and elsewhere. But at no point, they're raising these red flags around, learning Russian and the prospect of this war. And so we need to, at no point have they sought to explain exactly what is going on, why they think that might be the case, or give any indication of the probabilities or the likelihood. I mean, speaking for myself as an individual, I find it very difficult to believe that Russia would go to the point of provoking or inducing a war with NATO member states. I really can't see it happening. Strange things do happen. Accidents happen. Very, very, very dangerous things indeed happen. But the idea that Russia is to invade a NATO member state, I think, is highly unlikely indeed. So is NATO going to attack Russia? That's the flip side of that. If they're talking up the prospect of war, if they're talking up militarism because a confrontation with Russia is allegedly required, a military confrontation with Russia is allegedly required, is that what this is all about? And these are the risks that we face. And the risks are even greater when you consider the fact that NATO itself is not just a military alliance is a nuclear armed alliance. It's a nuclear armed alliance. That's its purpose. That's its function in Europe. And we also know that, and we have known for decades now, I mean, it's coming up to the 70th anniversary of something called the Russell-Einstein Manifesto, where there's two Nobel Prize winners warned that any war, any large-scale confrontation would lead to nuclear war and the possible destruction of humanity. They knew it 70 years ago. We know it now. So we have a nuclear-armed organization on a headlong rush to war. We have nuclear-armed NATO member states like the United Kingdom, France, talking up these prospects, spending billions more on their own nuclear weapons capabilities, expanding those nuclear weapons capabilities. We've got the Secretary General of this nuclear armed organization talking about, fighting or learning Russian. And it makes the upcoming NATO summit a very, very important occasion for anybody in Europe, not just people active in the peace movement, not just campaign for nuclear disarmament, but anybody who cares about the future to take some note of. And so CND will be joining an international coalition of organizations in The Hague, where this protest is to take place, to raise our concerns and to demand that the NATO member states step back from the brink, because the level and the scale of their rhetoric at the moment, the level and the scale of their remilitarization efforts, the level and the scale of the expansion of their nuclear capabilities are incredibly dangerous, if not potentially deadly. And so it's an important moment.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I think what you're doing with your answer to that question is opening up the need for, if you like, a second round, another podcast that specifically deals with the dangers of war with Russia, the challenges that everybody faces, including Britain, in encouraging a peaceful resolution of the Ukraine dispute. That's another big topic, and hopefully we can get together soon in the future and discuss that. Let me now move on, if I may, to my final question, and that is, well, you've already mentioned it, Tom. You mentioned Stop Rearm Europe, a coalition of anti-war and peace organisations across Europe that's beginning to develop. I know you're aware that opposition to rearmament is also taking shape amongst and within the various peace movements. Stop Rearm Europe was one of the first to take off. There are others in the offing. Perhaps we can finish on what is maybe a somewhat more optimistic note by talking about what the anti-war and peace movement is doing in order to intervene in this debate that we're talking about now. Tom, what do you think?
I think what we're potentially witnessing is the possible rebirth of a European-wide, confident, creative, and combative anti-war and peace movement. And I don't often slide into optimism, but I'm actually feeling fairly optimistic about the prospects for uniting and working together on the European scale against this. I mean, as you rightly point out, Carol, there have been a number of initiatives in reaction to European remilitarization that have come to the fore, and they've come from scientists. The famous theoretical physicist Carlo Rovelli was one of the first actually out of the blocks with his statement for scientists, warning in fairly stark terms and clear terms about the dangers, including the nuclear risks associated with rearmament, through to the political parties of all sorts across Europe, through to the peace movements, and so on and so forth. And what we've seen in a number of places are significant mobilizations, significant demonstrations and protests, of 100,000 in Italy, for instance, of sizable numbers in Spain, and even in Germany. I say even in Germany, which has been a very difficult territory for peace campaigners for a whole number of reasons over the past few years, whether it's questions around what is happening in Ukraine, which were fairly challenging in Germany, and especially in relation to any efforts at solidarity with the people of Palestine over the past year or more. It's been incredibly difficult, and yet, despite those difficulties, some German peace organizations have been able to come together and have protests at US bases in Germany, protesting against militarism, protesting against remilitarization, and raising the alarm there. So I think it's very promising indeed. And it's promising also on the European level in that, you've got scientists, you've got peace movements, you've got anti-war movements, you've got political parties of all sorts. You have organizations like Pax Christi, so if it's Catholics or Protestants or whatever. There is a coming together. But on top of that, you've seen now support from trade unions in Italy developing. And this is incredibly important, especially in the context of, the actions taken by dock workers in Genoa, I believe it was, and in other places, blocking arms sales to Israel. And you start to see the possibilities. Coming back to the UK, we clearly have work to do. Because we have large trade unions who represent members in Britain's significant military and nuclear industries, who are fully supportive of what the government is doing and who are buying into the idea that there will be some sort of defence dividend, as the government puts it, as a result of this military spending. Now, I went carefully through the strategic defence review and managed to find, promises for a few thousand more jobs for maybe the next 20 years or so, roundabout figures. We're not talking about mass job creation in this country on the basis of military spending. We're not talking about long-term secure jobs. We're not talking about the development of industries which will have a big multiplier effect in the rest of the economy, sort of increasing productive capacities across the board in the way that investment in other industries do. And yet, our trade unions are fully supporting and backing what the government is doing. So there are differences. It's uneven across Europe, but there are reasons to be optimistic that we can break out on a European scale in a variety of different ways and have a very, very clear, single-minded intention to rebuild the peace movement, rebuild the anti-war movement across the continent. And this will be a decisive factor, I believe, in changing the tune of the European governments, and making sure that when the likes of Mark Rutte come out with his tabloid rubbish in a supposedly serious press conference, there is a big, confident and creative movement which says, hang on, no. Even if you are serious, we will stand in your way. And we also need to be aware that we will need to have strategic discussions about exactly how we achieve our aims, because we can have big protests, we can have big mobilizations, we can have thousands and thousands of meetings, but at some point we will need to make a decision or a series of decisions about exactly how we can best intervene in the political landscape. And that will come, but it's very important questions for peace and disarmament activists in this country and across the continent.
You're absolutely right, Tom. I would say the most important question facing Europe in the medium term is the issue of whether or not we prepare for and therefore become more likely to go to war. It's been really interesting discussing this with you. Thank you very much, and thank you for ending in an optimistic note.
Thank you for inviting me.
It's not a matter of packing your bags and going to the foothills to avoid the explosions. There is still stuff that everyone can do. I hope you'll come back and join us in future in another podcast and talk about some of the issues that were thrown up during our discussion today. Tom Unterrainer, Chair of CND, thank you very much for taking part.